Fairies are a beloved and well-known aspect of Welsh folklore. Most people know the stories of the denizens of the Otherworld who visit us from some magical place to dance under full moon nights in wooded areas, to visit mortal marketplaces and cause all sorts of mischief in the process, or to rise from the depths of the lakes to marry mortal men, and usually there's a lot of taboos around those marriages as well. Stories of these denizens of the Otherworld are usually well known among lovers of folklore and mythology within the specific Welsh sphere. But what about stories pertaining to the fair folk of the sea? Mermaids. Well, that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, a croeso, welcome to my channel. My name is mhara.starling. I'm originally from Anglesey in North Wales. I'm a witch, and here on my channel I talk about the myth, lore and magic of Wales. Whilst not as common as y Tylwyth Teg, the fairies, the fair folk, we do have a fair few stories pertaining to mermaids from Wales, and that's not really a surprise when you consider the fact that there are numerous coastal communities located around the entirety of Cymru, of Wales. There are seaside towns and villages and all sorts of people who live directly on the sea, so it makes sense that there would be an entire corpus of belief surrounding the mysteries of the waves. And one aspect of these more coastal elements of folklore is, of course, mermaids. I grew up in a coastal village. I'm from Aberfraw. Aberfraw is a village located in the southeastern area of the Isle of Anglesey, of Ynys Môn, and it sits directly on yr Afon Ffraw, the River Ffraw, which is a saltwater river that runs directly into the sea, and there are numerous little coves and beaches around the entirety of the coastal path there, so I've always had an affinity for the sea. And my affinity for the sea, mixed with my affinity for magic and for fairies, ultimately led me to being obsessed with mermaids. I've always been obsessed with mermaids. I've always been the mermaid person in my family and in my friend groups and such. So today I'm really excited to talk about aspects of the folklore of Wales which focus on these fishy, otherworldly entities. So first and foremost, what do we call mermaids? In the Welsh language, in Cymraeg, what do we call mermaids? The word for mermaid in Welsh is môr forwyn. Môr forwyn. Now, if we split it up into two different words, we've got the word môr and the word forwyn. Môr is the word that just means the sea. So it's spelt M-O-R, and it has a little roof, or a circumflex is the actual technical word for that little thing. We call it tor bach, a little roof in Welsh, and it's there to basically showcase that O is an elongated letter. So the Welsh language is a phonetic language, as you should know if you've watched my previous videos. So if you learn the phonetic sounds of each individual letter, reading Welsh is really, really easy, and that's a hint for those of you who want to learn Welsh. Just learn the phonetic sounds for each and every individual letter, and it'll help you on your way tremendously. But when you see a circumflex, or a little roof, a tor bach as we call it, it just means that that letter goes from being a short sound to a longer sound. So in the context of this word, môr, rather than being mor, because we pronounce M as M, O as O, and R as R. So rather than just being mor, it's môr. So that's the word for the sea in Welsh. And then forwyn comes from morwyn, which basically means a maiden, a virgin, those kinds of things. So if we translate môr forwyn, literally, it's just maiden of the sea, or more specifically, sea maiden. Now, some of you might be confused because there are numerous books and websites and such out there that claim that the word for mermaid in Welsh is morgen, or morgan. And morgan is an interesting word because we do, if you were to, say, for example, turn these into Welsh words, you could translate morgen to mean birth of the sea. So like those who are born of the sea. So it makes sense that that might be the Welsh word for a mermaid, right? Those who are born of the sea. But the word morgen doesn't really show up in traditional Welsh folklore, nor does it even have a place in the Welsh dictionary. If you go onto a dictionary such as the Geiriadur Prifysgol Cymru, the University of Wales Welsh Dictionary, and you type in the word morgen, nothing comes up because it's not really a word that has ever been used in a traditional sense in Wales. So where does this idea that morgan is a Welsh word for mermaid and they're a type of Welsh mermaid come from? Well, that's quite simple. It's a word from Brythoneg, from the language of the Bretons, the language of Brittany. And Brittany has a language which is similar to us in that it's a Brythonic Celtic language. So we share a lot of similarities in the way we spell things, in the way we pronounce things, of course, with differences because it's a different culture over there. But, you know, if I was listening to someone speaking Brythoneg, I would only need maybe 10 minutes of listening to them before I started picking up on the words. That's how similar Welsh and Breton is. So when people have been delving into the folklore of these various Celtic regions, you'll know if you watch my channel that there is a huge issue with the homogenization of the Celtic cultures. There's this obsession in the greater Anglo-centric world with taking the word Celtic and assuming that every Celtic nation is basically the same when we're not. We have our own cultures, our own identities, our own histories, and our own mythology and folklore as well. So what's probably happened at some point down the line is that somebody's seen the word morgan in association with mermaid-like beings and assumed that it must be a Welsh word. But it's not traditionally a Welsh word. The Welsh word for mermaid is mor forwyn. So don't listen to those websites and books that claim that that's the word for it in Welsh, because it's not true, and you will be you'll find it incredibly hard to find a book that dates back any further than the 21st or the late 20th century that claims this. So yes, mor forwyn, not Morgan. So what do the mermaids of Wales look like? Well, that's quite simple. They look pretty much like any other mermaid found anywhere else in the world. So mermaids in Welsh stories are usually described as being from the top of their head down to their waist, looking exactly like mortal women. Usually they're extremely beautiful because they seduce and sing to sailors as they're sailing by, and men usually can't keep their hands to themselves when they see mermaids, so they are supposed to be ethereally beautiful as well. Usually they're depicted with long, flowing, curly hair, and they're usually combing their hair as they sing on the rocks and such. So they're very beautiful from the top to the waist, but then from the waist down, they are animalistic, and specifically they have the features of a fish. They have the tail of a fish. So usually the tails are described as being long and scaly with spreading fins. So pretty much like mermaids look everywhere else. There are a few things that mermaids are associated with, and one of those things is weather. So in some stories, mermaids seem to have the ability to control the weather. So they can control the coming of storms, they can conjure storms at the blink of an eye and such. But in most stories, rather than being able to control the weather, they instead have some kind of precognitive ability to decipher when a storm is coming. So they know the weather patterns so intimately that they can tell when a change is about to happen and a storm is on the way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. As well as being associated with the weather and with singing and with the sea, obviously, mermaids are also often associated with cursing. And I'm not talking about swear words now, though Welsh women are very good at that, but mermaids are associated with cursing in the magical sense. And basically, within this context, what I'm talking about is that there are numerous stories where mermaids lay curses on people who cause them harm. Specifically men, most of the time it's men because it's the men that's causing them harm, but they have also been known to curse entire communities. And the best example of this is the story of the mermaid of Conwy. Now, I grew up not too far away from Conwy. We used to travel through Conwy all the time, and we used to go and eat our fish and chips on the beach in Conwy. So I've been told the story of the mermaid of Conwy since I was a child, and I've always been a little obsessed with it. And the story goes like this. So once upon a time, in the lovely picturesque town of Conwy, a mermaid washed up after a great storm. She found herself stuck in the sand and she couldn't move herself back towards the sea because the tide was so low. A group of people started gathering on the beach, noticing that this mystical creature had just washed up on their beach. And so the mermaid started reaching her hand out to these people and pleading with them, begging with them, please help me, carry me back to the sea or else I will die. Nobody listened to her. They were all terrified of this beastly creature that had washed up on their coastline. Eventually, a group of men started walking over to the mermaid, led by one incredibly boisterous and loud and probably a little drunk man as well. The mermaid suddenly got excited, thinking that these men were about to help her. So she pleaded once more, "Please help me, carry me to the sea, place just my tail in the water and I will be safe. Please help me." And the men grabbed her by the arms and by the tail and they picked her up, and she thought to herself, "Finally, I'm going to be safe, I'm going to be back in my watery home." When suddenly they started going the opposite direction. Rather than heading down towards the waves, these men started walking towards the town. The mermaid started screaming, "No, no, take me to the water, not to the town. What are you doing?" But the men ignored her. They started jeering and sneering and shouting and laughing. And they started going on and on about how they'd caught a mermaid and they were going to show everyone. And so they paraded her around the town, carrying her above their heads, throwing her onto tables, playing with her fins, and just altogether being arseholes, really. And so the mermaid was pleading and crying and begging this entire time, asking them, "Please take me back to the water or else I will die." And eventually it reached a point where she knew it was too late. She was about to perish. She was about to dry out. And so with her last breath, she uttered a curse. She shouted out across the entire town, echoing and reverberating through all the walls of every home in that place. She said, "This place, forevermore for your unkindness, shall be a place of disaster, shall be a place of disease, and shall be a place of poverty. This place is cursed." And then she died. And what's interesting about that story is that we do have some historical evidence to back up the idea that Conwy was indeed a place of ill fortune and disaster for the longest time. So perhaps this story was an explanation for the fact that the town was known as a place of poverty, as a place of disaster, as a place of disease and illness for so long. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe a mermaid actually did curse the town for their unkindness. But moving away from a mermaid being able to curse people, we also have stories of mermaids blessing people. So that idea of the mermaid cursing an entire town is not rare. It comes up a lot. Usually they curse individual people who cause them unkindness, but in that story it's an extreme and it's an entire town. But there are some stories as well where they bless people who help them, or sometimes they bless people who change their mind about harming them. And that's the case for the next story I want to tell you, which is Peregrine and the Mermaid. Peregrine and the Mermaid is a story that was collected by W. Jenkins Thomas in his Welsh Fairy book. If you haven't got a copy of this, go grab yourself one. It's filled to the brim with stories from Wales. And in that story, which is located down in Pembrokeshire in the south of Wales, a fisherman was once out on the sea, just catching fish, doing his usual day, when suddenly he saw something in the water that caught his eye, and that something was a mermaid. From the head down to the waist, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and instantly he was infatuated with her. He was under her spell, and he didn't quite mind that from the waist down she had the tail of a fish, a long scaly tail with wide spreading fins at the bottom. He just didn't care. She was too beautiful for him to care. And so he slowly and quietly took his boat over to her and he scooped her out of the water, threw her into his boat, tied her up, and then started heading directly for the shore. When he got to the shore, he carried her into his home. All the while she was screaming and screeching and crying, asking him, let me go back to my home. But he would not listen. Eventually he got to his house and he threw her into the spare bedroom and locked the door. And now she was his prisoner because he was just so in love with her, he couldn't imagine letting her go. She pleaded with him, please let me go or else I will die, but he didn't believe her. And he kept her there for days, but she refused to eat, she refused to talk with him, and she withered away. Aside from the fact that she would plead every now and then for him to release her, she would be quiet and she would just weep in that room all alone. One day he went down to the pub and he was talking to one of the locals who happened to know a lot about magical things. He was rumoured in the area to be a bit of a cunning man, a conjurer. And he told this man, I found a mermaid. mermaid, and she's so beautiful that I took her home, and now she sits in my spare bedroom, and she is my prized possession." The man leaned into him and said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." And he recounted to him the tale of the Mermaid of Conwy and how that mermaid had cursed an entire town for centuries. And so suddenly Peregrine got very scared. This mermaid has the ability to curse him? And so he decided he would head home that night and he would release her. When he got home, he unlocked the bedroom door, and as he walked in, the mermaid started to speak. And she said to him, "If you let me go, I will bless you with 3 opportunities where I will come to you in your time of most need, and I will help you. I will ensure that you stay safe throughout this lifetime if you release me." And so sneaky Peregrine didn't tell her that he'd already planned to release her under fear that she was going to curse him, and so he scooped her up and took her back to the sea. She waved to him and promised, "I will be back in your time of most need," and she swam away. A few months went by, and Peregrine was out on his boat again one morning, when suddenly a little voice from the water caught his ear. "Peregrine, Peregrine, set sail back for the shore. It's time for you to go home, for something terrible is about to happen." He recognized the voice. It was the mermaid. And so he listened to her heeding. He said, "Okay, time to go home." And he lifted his oar, he lifted his anchor, and he headed back home towards the shore. Later that afternoon, one of the most ferocious storms that have ever hit that part of Wales hit that coastline, and almost all the other local fishermen met their doom at the hands of that storm, all aside from Peregrine, who had been saved by the mermaid. And that's an example of how the mermaids seem to have this precognitive ability to know when storms are coming. She came to Peregrine and warned him of the oncoming storm. Mermaids tend to be quite rooted in the folkloric tradition of Wales. We don't really have many stories of mermaids in, say, the Mabinogi or in older mythology. We do have gods and such that are associated with the sea. One example, of course, is Llyr. Llyr is the father of Branwen and Manawydan and such, the characters of the second branch of the Mabinogi. The word Llyr literally means flow or the flow of water, or sometimes it's used as a word to denote the seas itself. And there are numerous sea-based connotations around the children of Llyr and the family branch of the children of Llyr. But he's not really a merman. He's never described as such anyway. But we do have some poetry from, say, around the 16th century, which seems to hint at some ideas surrounding mermaid-like beings rooted in Welsh culture. And one of these characters is Gwenhydwy. Now, the name Gwenhydwy is in and of itself quite evocative, because if we take that name and we break it down, you could translate that name to essentially mean blessed spell of the sea, or blessed magic of the sea. The Gwen part comes from a word that basically denotes fairness or blessedness. Hyd could be translated to magic, and we could come from gwi, which means like flow or water. So she's the blessed magic of water, or the blessed magic of the sea. But where does Gwenhydwy come from? Well, the oldest mention of Gwenhydwy comes from a 16th century poem by a bard named Llwyd ap Rhys ap Rhicert. And in this poem, the bard is describing his pilgrimage over to the island of Bardsey, Ynys Enlli. And as he's travelling over the water, he describes the rough waters that separate the mainland of Wales from Bardsey Island as Haid o ddefaid Gwenhydwy, a naw hwrdd yn un a hwy, which translates roughly to mean a troop of the sheep of Gwenhydwy and 9 rams along with them. So he's describing the waves in this context as a flock of sheep that belong to somebody called Gwenhydwy. And this flock of sheep have a ram every 9th wave. Every 9th wave is stronger than the rest of the waves. Now, Gwenhydwy is a bit of a shadowy figure, because apart from this mention in this poem, we don't have much else to go off of her, apart from mentions here and there in folklore, very shadowy, elusive mentions. So she's mentioned again in the story of the sinking of the bottom 100, Cantre'r Gwylod. Cantre'r Gwylod is sometimes referred to as the Welsh Atlantis. It's a region in Wales which is now supposedly submerged under water, a lost area or a lost kingdom submerged under the sea waves. And in this story, one of the characters is warned of the fact that the sea is about to consume the entirety of the landscape by a voice that is carried on the wind. And in most versions of the story, that voice is said to be the voice of Gwenhydwy. And in these stories, what's really interesting is that Gwenhydwy is described as the mermaid shepherd of the seas. She who basically shepherds the waves. So that in and of itself gives us a little bit more insight into who Gwenhydwy is. She is a mermaid who seems to have some kind of control over the waves. She comes up again in the works of W.I. Evans Wentz. So in the fairy faith in Celtic countries, there is one person that Evans Wentz interviewed who states that Gwenhydwy is the name of the queen of the fairies in Wales. But in that instance, she's more of an airy, cloudy being rather than anything to do with the sea. So we see these strange mentions of her popping up constantly. But the one constant seems to be that she's associated with the sea, and that she is referred to as a mermaid. Now, I know it's not much to go off of, but in my own personal practice, I revere Gwenhydwy as a sea goddess. I see myself as a little bit of a sea witch because I grew up on the coast, and a lot of my magic involves the utilization of things like seashells and working with the tides and working with the moon and such, so I see myself as a little bit of a sea witch. And in that context, I have worked spiritually with this being, Gwenhydwy, for a while. And Gwenhydwy, to me, is a goddess associated with the movements of the sea itself. So here is still the god of the sea in general within my practice, but Gwenhydwy is she who moves the sea. She is the currents, she is the tides, she is the waves. So I see her as the shepherd of the seas and the queen of the waves. And I've just triggered almost every single person who grew up in my generation with Barbie movies, because there's a song called Queen of the Waves. But that's how I see her. She is the goddess of tempestuous waters and the currents and the tides and the nourishing of the landscape by our salt water. Beyond the mermaids found in folklore and mythology, we also have mermaids in sightings across the entirety of Wales, stretching back to at least the 17th century. So in the 17th century, for example, a mermaid was sighted by a man named Thomas Reynold in the village of Pendine in Carmarthenshire. She was splashing in the waves, and numerous witnesses saw her, and this was all printed in a little booklet about the sighting and the strange creatures that can be seen in the waters of Wales. In 1858, there was a sighting of a mermaid somewhere between Fishguard and St David's. And then in 1910, the newspaper The Pembrokeshire Herald and General Advertiser published a story about a woman who lived locally and was believed to be a mermaid. She appeared out of nowhere, and people seemed to believe that she was a mermaid who came from the depths of the sea. So mermaids show up not just in our folklore and mythology, but they seem to be sighted as well. And one of the interesting things about mermaids, for me personally, because I wrote a book all about fairies, and I love to explore the lore of various beings and entities throughout Welsh folklore and folk belief in general. And mermaids and fairies seem to coexist in a similar way. Mermaids are often just seen as the fairies of the sea. And what's interesting is that fairies have undergone a lot of misconception over the years. When you say the word fairy to people, they tend to envision small flower fairies, such as those in the drawings of Cicely Mary Barker. Small, gossamer-winged, cute little women with ballerina-type skirts dancing around on flower petals and such. And they are often seen as incredibly benevolent, sweet, and cute. And that's not really reflective of what we see in folklore pertaining to fairies in Wales, nor anywhere else in the world, really. Fairies are often quite scary. They're usually varied in size, and most of the time are just the same size as us, and wings aren't really something that we really see associated with fairies. So fairies have this abundance of misinformation that have built up around them. but we don't see the same amount of misinformation building up about mermaids. If you were to describe a mermaid, or ask somebody who didn't really know much about folklore at all to describe a mermaid, they would probably tell you about the idea of a woman who is a woman from the head down to the waist, and then a fish from the waist down, or the fish tail. They would say that they're associated with singing. They would say that they're associated with the drowning of men. They would say that they're associated with waves and currents and with the weather and such. So all of these different associations that people have with mermaids today still stand quite strong next to the folkloric versions of mermaids, at least within a Welsh context. So my question to you, as we reach the end of this video, is, do you believe in mermaids? Because I certainly do. If you'd like to learn more about the folklore and magic of Wales, then please subscribe to me here on YouTube. You can also find me elsewhere. These videos are only possible because of my patrons. You can support me on Patreon for as little as £1 a month, or you can join me there for free if you wish as well. The link to that will be down in the description below. If you found this video interesting and you would like to learn more about the myth and lore of the sea, specifically within a Welsh context, then I have a class that's available to purchase on my Patreon. Of course, if you become a Patreon subscriber, you get access to it anyway through your subscription. But if you would like to just purchase this one class, which is called Chwedloniaeth y Môr, the lore of the sea, then you can go and purchase that for, I think it's £5 at the minute over on my Patreon. It's an hour-long class, and it just focuses on the magic and lore of the seas and the coasts within a specifically Welsh context. I have numerous other videos and articles and essays and classes and courses just like that over on my Patreon, so do check me out. I'm also a bit of a rash. Now that you've rubbed up against me, you won't be able to be rid of me because they don't sell anti-mhara fungal cream anywhere in the world at the moment. I'm incurable. So now that you found me here, why not find me elsewhere, because I'm bound to pop up even if you don't go and seek me out. I'm available on Instagram, on Threads, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on pretty much everything. Come find me on TikTok, I'm everywhere. And of course, don't forget that my books, this is my second book, Welsh Fairies, a guide to the lore, legends, denizens and deities of the Otherworld, but I also have another book, Welsh Witchcraft. Both of those are out now and available to purchase wherever books are sold. So you can buy them on the big conglomerates like Amazon and such, but I would recommend going to your local independent bookseller, or come and find me at local events. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments, do you believe in mermaids, and what other aspects of Welsh folklore would you like to see explored on this channel? Diolch o galon, thank you from the heart, and I will see you all very soon. Ta-ra!